what we could do with Alexander Hamilton. It's not going to be complete in any sense, but what I wanted to do is, as you can see here, I wrote this timetable on the board. What's tomorrow? January 11th. When was Alexander Hamilton born? 258 years ago tomorrow. So he was born in 1757. As you can see, he arrived in the United States when he was a young man, 16 or something. And then there's other details, but I'm not going to go through his life personally, detail by detail, but I want to just sum up a certain idea, which is that before he became Treasury Secretary, which was 1789, there was a lot that had to happen before then. The American Revolution, which happened. And in 6 years of the American Revolution, we practically wrecked ourselves. And this is exactly what, and I find this really beautiful. I find this the genius of Hamilton. Here he is. You see, in 1776, he's working. He's an unknown guy. He's working, you know, he's in the army, and he was assigned to the artillery, and he beat the daylights out of the Hessians, and he fought in the Battle of Staten Island, and he was a good, you know, military kid. The guy, he was pretty young. Then he's asked to be aide-de-camp to the general-in-chief of the whole American Revolution. He's a young kid, you know, a young guy, 12, 19, 20 years old. But already he's working with the top leadership of the United States to be. And look at that, 1778. What does that mean? The first Publius letter. He was agitating for a constitution and a fight for a republic under a pseudonym. And he would write pamphlets. He was in the military. He's working for the commander-in-chief. He's a young guy, and he's a new, you know, fairly recent immigrant. Here he is doing political organizing, working for the commander-in-chief, winning battles, etc. The guy was not a wimp. Not that, all right? And then other things happened. But I want to just want to get your attention on two things he said before the Federalist Papers were written and before he became, obviously, the Secretary of the Treasury. He was writing to James Duane, apparently a friend. He was writing to him in 1780. So that's when he was, you know, the war is going on. He's writing political documents, etc. But here he is writing to a friend about the condition of our United States before we became a United States. We were living under a Articles of Confederation, meaning the colonies had come together and said, we'll tolerate each other, but hell with it, you know. We'll tolerate each other and we'll fight this war, but you know, that's as far as we go. So he's in the military. He's writing to a friend. He says, the more I see, the more I find reason for those who love this country to weep over its blindness. And he says at one point, this is before all this other stuff, this politics. He's in the military. The fundamental defect is a want of power in Congress because of three causes. An excess of the spirit of liberty, which has made the particular states jealous, and they want all the power each individually in their own hands. All right? And the fact that Congress has no powers. They're timid, they're diffident. They're timid. And they've left themselves without any power. And then there's no means to, at their disposal to actually deal with the public necessities, like a military. And he said, to depend on the states individually, we have to depend on their commitment to the army one by one. You can't just have a military, you have to have each state volunteering. And he said, so we have to establish basically the dependence on the states as a collective, not individually. You can't have an army. And he said, this confederation is defective and it requires itself to be altered. It is neither fit for war or peace. We're not going to make it. This is 1780, way back. It's required to be altered. The idea of an uncontrollable sovereignty in each state over its internal police will defeat the other powers given to Congress and make our union feeble and precarious. And then he said, we don't have the money, we don't have a strong executive. And he said the Army, now here he is in the Army. He said, a third defect is the fluctuating constitution of our Army. This has been a pregnant source of evil. All our military misfortunes, 3/4 of our civil embarrassments are to be ascribed to it. Without a speedy change in the Army, we will dissolve. It is a mob. It's not an army. Without clothing, without pay, without provision, without morals, without discipline, we begin to hate the country for its neglect of us. And the country hates us because we're oppressing them. Congress has been long jealous of us. So he said we are ripening for dissolution. In 1780, we were about finished. Now here, you know, that's pretty devastating. So what does he propose? This is really beautiful. This was a proposal he made, and he issued a military order, actually 2 years before he wrote that. Guess what he was going to propose to the young Confederation? He said, I'm presenting, he's written military orders with a guy named Colonel Lawrence, and Colonel Lawrence is going to another commander. And he's, you know, showing him Hamilton's orders. And he said, I'm glad he's on his way to South Carolina, and this project is excellent. What I'm proposing, and he's going to carry out, is that we're going to raise 2 or 3 or 4 battalions of Negroes with the assistance of the government of that state by contributions from the owners in proportion to the number they possess. So what is he saying? Remember Lincoln's fight to raise a black regiments? Remember the humongous, remember on the Civil War, you all remember that? Humongous fight, blah, 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 you know. Here's Alexander Hamilton giving an order which is being carried out by a colonel to actually begin in South Carolina the first 3 regiments of black soldiers. And he said, of course, as soon as they fight in the war, they're free. There's going to be, this is manumission. This is going to be the end of slavery as we succeed as a nation. So the first thing most people think about is our founding fathers were a bunch of old white crackers and they were all racist and they had slaves. Oh, shut up. I mean, there was bad guys then just like there's bad guys today. All right? This was going to be the beginning of the change before we even had a full constitution. And he said, he basically said, just one little comment. He said, I have frequently heard it objected to the scheme of embodying Negroes that they are too stupid to make soldiers. This is so far from appearing to me valid that I think their want of cultivation, of having education, etc., plus the fact that they're slaves, they're being subordinated, they're put in a life of servitude, will enable them sooner or later, getting out of that, to become better soldiers than our white inhabitants. Let officers be men of sense and sentiment, and the nearer the soldiers are developed, the better. Anyway, so I thought that was interesting. Every prejudice you have, every little populist thing you got on Rush Limbaugh or Amy Goodman or anything you heard about any of this, you don't know anything. I mean, you have to read some of the original. So the basic ideas, what I want to do, and because this is such a humongous topic, as you can see, you had Yorktown, etc., Constitutional Convention, it was going to be discussed. And now what happened is, in terms of what Alexander Hamilton was doing was trying to convince the people of New York State, of which he lived in New York. He was trying to convince them to support a vote. Each state had to, or each confederated state had to vote in support of whether your state would accept the Constitution, which was already written which was proposed in 1787 at the convention in Philadelphia. Now, then your state, your confederated state, was going to vote yes or no. Will you accept this Constitution or not? We needed 9 states to accept the Constitution, and then it would become the Constitution. And New York was one of the worst. They were holding out, as you might well imagine. Why would New York hold out? Anyone have a hint? Huh? Yeah, and Wall Street. Guess what? Wall Street, New York. And what Alexander Hamilton did is he wrote a series of articles with John Jay and James Madison. They were both older than he was. But it's called the Federalist Papers. Why? Because they're a series of articles that were submitted to New York newspapers. So he would write an article, submit it to a newspaper, they would publish it. It would be like a pamphlet, because the whole city, the whole state got to read it. And he signed all of his Publius. That was his, secret name. Anyway, what I want to do, just because it is serious business, what we're talking about here is polemicizing against the backwardness. I mean, what is he saying about white soldiers? He's saying they're morons. I mean, here he is fighting a war, and he's one of the leaders, and he's saying we're going to lose. I mean, these guys are bad. We don't have any control over how many soldiers we get. We don't have control over the money. We don't have, I mean, this is like getting scary. We might not have been here today. So he decided to organize the people of New York with convincing them step by step in a reasoned discussion on why they should support this. Now I want each of you to be in the footsteps, in the mindset, because you're organizing today for a change, and you've got to get under people's skin. Now here he is writing the first Federalist paper, and each one of them is entitled "To the People of the State of New York." Now I want everyone's going to get one, and each of you are going to take turns reading, 4 sentences or half a paragraph or whatever. But I want you to be Alexander Hamilton organizing the dumbheads in New York that he's trying to organize. So everybody can.
Got dumbheads everywhere.
You can pass me.
I couldn't read it and understand it.
Well, he's left. Yeah, you can see.
Yeah.
That's a good enough reason for the pack to be in New York this week, right?
Yeah. But think of it this way. First of all, you're a citizen of New York, and you're being organized by Alexander Hamilton. And don't be intimidated by the words, the big ones. Don't be intimidated by the big words. Concentrate as much as you can on the overall picture. You have another one? Pat, how many are left? How many are left? I just want to see the one. Okay, then there's one. I just want to see the way people are. Okay, so let's start. Brian, you can start. Or wait, are you reading? Okay. You can start and read half a paragraph or a paragraph, whatever.
Okay, go ahead. Okay. To the people of the state of New York, after an unequivocal experience of the inefficiency of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. The subject speaks its own importance, comprehending in its consequences nothing less than the existence of the Union, the safety and welfare of the parts of which it is composed, the fate of an empire in many respects the most interesting in the world. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. If there be any truth in the remark, the crisis at which we are arrived may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, in a wrong election of the part we shall act may, in this view, deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind.
This idea will add the inducements of philanthropy to those of patriotism, to heighten the solicitude which all considerate and good men must feel for the event. Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. But this is a thing more ardently to be wished than seriously to be expected. The plan offered to our deliberations affects too many particular interests, innovates upon too many local institutions, not to involve in its discussion a variety of objects foreign to its merits, and of views, passions, and prejudices little favorable to the discovery of truth.
Among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of the power, emolument, and consequence of the offices they hold under the state establishments, and the perverted ambition of another class of men who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusions of their country, or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies than from its union under one government.
It is not, however, my design to dwell upon observations of this nature. I am well aware that it would be disingenuous to resolve indiscriminately the opposition of any set of men, merely because their situations might subject them to suspicion, into interested or ambitious views. Candor will oblige us to admit that even such men may be actuated by upright intentions, and it cannot be doubted that much of the opposition which has made its appearance, or may hereafter make its appearance, will spring from sources blameless at least, if not respectable, the honest errors of minds led astray by preconceived jealousies and fears. So numerous indeed, and so powerful are the causes which serve to give a false bias to the judgment, that we, upon many occasions, see wise and good men on the wrong as well as on the right side of questions of the first magnitude of society. This circumstance, if duly attended to, would furnish a lesson of moderation to those who are ever so much persuaded by their being in the right in any controversy. And a further reason for caution in this respect might be drawn from the reflection that we are not always sure that those who advocate the truth are influenced by purer principles than their antagonists. Ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and many other motives not more laudable than these, are apt to operate as well upon those who support as those who oppose the right side of a question. Were there not even these inducements to moderation, nothing could be more ill-judged than that intolerant spirit which has, at all times, characterized political parties. For in politics, as in religion, it is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution.
And yet, however, just these sentiments will be allowed to be, we have already sufficient indications that it will happen in this as in all former cases of great national discussion. A torrent of angry and malignant passions will be let loose. To judge from the conduct of the opposite parties, we shall be led to conclude that they will mutually hope to evince the justice of their opinions and to increase the number of their converts by the loudness of their declamations and the bitterness of their invectives. Enlightened zeal for the energy and efficiency of government will be stigmatized as the offspring of a temper fond of despotic power and hostile to the principles of liberty. An over-scrupulous jealousy of danger to the rights of the people, which is more commonly the fault of the head than of the heart, will be represented as mere pretense and artifice, the stale bait for popularity at the expense of the public good. It will be forgotten, on the one hand, that jealousy is the usually concomitant of love, and that the noble enthusiasm of liberty is apt to be infected with a spirit of narrow and illiberal distrust. On the other hand, it will be equally forgotten that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty, that in the contemplation of a sound and well-informed judgment, their interests can never be separated, and that a dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mass of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidden appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. History will teach us that the former has been found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter, and that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and envying tyrants.
Just that 1 second. Doesn't that remind you of every color revolution?
Yes.
Yeah.
Demagogues appealing to the people.
And then they turn into tyrants.
Here he is.
Sounds like Obama to me.
It also makes me question even more Jeffersonian democracy.
Right, and Lena will talk about that. All right.
In the course of the preceding observations, I have had an eye, my fellow citizens, to putting you upon your guard against all attempts, from whatever quarter, to influence your decision in a matter of the utmost moment to your welfare, by any impressions other than those which may result from the evidence of truth. You will, no doubt, at the same time, have collected from the general scope of them that they proceed from a source not unfriendly to the new Constitution. Yes, my countrymen, I own to you that, after having given it an attentive consideration, I am clearly of opinion it is your interest to adopt it. I am convinced that this is the safest course for your liberty, your dignity, and your happiness. I affect not reserves which I do not feel. I will not amuse you with an appearance of deliberation when I have decided. I frankly acknowledge to you my convictions, and I will freely lay before you the reasons from which they are founded. The conscience of good intentions disdains ambiguity. I shall not, however, multiply professions on this head. My motives must remain in the depository of my own breast. My arguments will be open to all, and may be judged by all. They shall at least be offered in a spirit which will not disgrace the cause of truth.
I propose in a series of papers to discuss the following interesting particulars: the utility of the Union to your political prosperity, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve that Union, the necessity of a government at least equally energetic with the one proposed to the attainment of this object, the conformity of the proposed Constitution to the key principles of Republican government, its analogy to your own state constitution, and lastly, the additional security which its adoption will afford to the preservation of that species of government, to liberty and to property.
In the process of this discussion, I shall endeavor to give a satisfactory answer to all the objections which shall have made their appearance that may seem to have any claim to your attention.
Red.
It may perhaps be thought superfluous to offer arguments to prove the utility of the Union. A point, no doubt, deeply engraved on the hearts of the great body of the people in every state, and one which it may be imagined has no adversary. But the fact is that we already hear it whispered in the private circles of those who oppose the new Constitution that 13 states are of too great extent for any general system, and that we must of necessity resort to the separate confederacies of distinct portions of the whole. This doctrine will, in all probability, be gradually propagated till it has votaries enough to countenance and open avowal of it. For nothing can be more evident to those who are able to take an enlarged view of the subject than the alternative of an adoption of the new Constitution or dismemberment of the Union. It will therefore be of use to begin by examining the advantage of the Union, the certain avails, and the probable dangers to which every state will be exposed from its dissolution. This shall accordingly constitute the subject of my next address at the Publius.
So that's your homework assignment. I really think people should buy this or get out of the library and read one a day or etc. But I mean, since we are short on time to elaborate on all these, each of these Federalist papers is discussing a principle of the Constitution, and each and every one tears down the idea that a state can make it on its own. You know, and I'll just use one example, because Lena's going to discuss the whole question of credit in the nation. But take, for example, if you're a citizen of New York City, and New York City is the harbor for the world, right? So every single good at that time, let's say, or the majority, rather than just South Carolina or something, but New York City was the entry point for ships from various countries coming in The British, of course, dominated, but other countries ultimately could come in the future. So you are, the citizens of New York State, New York City, New York State, are putting an import fee on everything that comes through their port, correct? That's how you do it. All right, now, that's a confederated state of the Union. It's not a union yet, it's a confederation. Now, I'm a citizen of New York, but you're from Connecticut, and I say, you owe me an export, or I'm exporting to you, so you owe me an import duty on what I'm exporting to you. You owe me. So New York, the state of New York, is now becoming the exporter to other states in the union, in the country, and each of those other states has to pay tribute to New York to get any goods out of the harbors of New York. That's one example that he uses, that if each state is an entity in itself, and you're a sovereign entity, then nobody can mess with your commerce, your trade, and he uses the example in a couple of them where he said in Europe they all say that states that belong, countries that are next to each other and side by side and engage in commerce, they're always friendly. He said, excuse me, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Venetian Empire, and he goes through this explicitly, going, explaining to Americans, that's bunk, And anyway, that's the kind of very detailed discussion, whether it's military. If we're only just Confederates, we'll all be friendly. We don't need any armies. Yeah, right. Except if you take 5 inches of my ground, I'm going to kill you. So each state would be warring against each other state on territory, just like in Europe. You'd be warring on commerce. You'd be warring on export duties. You'd be warring on everything. And he's going through each thing, and he's asking you to reason with yourself to figure out why what you believe is malarkey, what you believe is not true. So anyway, that's the. So I figured you can get a flavor of him with this number one. But then this is accessible at libraries and in bookstores, and it's really worth reading. So
What's it called? The New Federalist?
it's called the Federalist. Some books they call it the Federalist Papers. I have 3 copies of it. This one is the Federalist, but it's most of them they call it the Federalist Papers because they're all printed. They were all printed articles in New York newspapers. And by the way, just look at this. Alexander Hamilton, everyone who's lived in New York City, you'll love this. He founded the New York Evening Post. Well, guess what? The New York Post is is still around. It's the longest living newspaper in the United States, but unfortunately it's become a tabloid with a lot of sex stories and sensational stuff. If you work in New York and you take the subway, you always buy the Post so you can open it up and not jab somebody next to you. The New York Times is too big to open up on the subway. So.
And it's owned by Rupert Murdoch.
What's really notable is the way he ends the letter here. The argument was that the states would be stronger if they weren't so unionized, and if I'm saying the right word there, but he is saying here from the standpoint of debate that it would lead to their dissolution, not their strengthening, if they went that way. It would be to their detriment rather than any strength gain.
Yeah, there is no, the Union, the Constitution is representing, as Lynn keeps stressing, the United States is a United States. It's not a confederation of each state can decide how much you want to be part of this grouping of people. And that's exactly it. So now Lena's going to bring up another whole area and on the credit policy, and then at the end we can open it up for further discussion.
Oh, you can stay if you like. There's a chair over here.
Oh, right there.
Oh, that's fine.
Yes, Chuck. My name's Lena Platt, for those who don't know me. But in just continuing from what Maureen said, the last that she said on this matter of the separate states in a confederation and, ending up fighting against each other and a dissolution, the thing that was uppermost in Hamilton's mind, and you can see it reflected in this process here, was the British retaking the United States if you did not have a union. If you do not have a strong central government, national government, if you didn't have a national bank that was responsible for the development of the entire nation, and if you didn't have a system of national credit, emphasis on national, so that you had a union, and this union was, big, obviously, physically, and strong, and but philosophically, which was the most important thing, I think, in Hamilton, and he wrote, I think it's 50 or 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers. So he was really the intellectual author of a lot of the American system. But his idea was that the British system, he was, as you may know, he was born in a little island called Nevis. We don't have a map. But if you know where the Leeward Islands are in the Caribbean, there's a bunch of little dots. It was a slave colony, British slave colony. He was born in one of those. And actually, because he was a bastard, he was, he was illegitimate. He could not attend school because the schools were run by the churches, the Anglican church in this case, the Episcopal church, as you know it here. And so he was largely self-taught. And when you read, like we were reading just now, and when Maureen describes this process of him trying to provoke in the mind of the reader to think about these matters in a Socratic way and come to their decision, you get a sense that his study of the Greek and Roman classics on his own, which is what he did. He was self-taught and he had tutors, but he read the classics on his own when he was 11 and that kind of an age. You see the influence of that in his writings. But anyway, to go back to what I was saying earlier, probably because of his birth and the fact that it was a slave, plantation run by the British, and then of course coming to the United States and getting into the fight to win the most important revolution against the British Empire. Everything that Hamilton did was informed by the idea that we had to keep the Union strong, together and strong, lest the British snuck back in, as of course they did in War of 1812 and the Civil War. So what I want to try to give a sketch of, since we don't have a lot of time, and this fellow writes a lot, and you can see how he writes is not that conversant to what we know nowadays. But what I want to try to give a sense of is why LaRouche, first of all, is saying, and has been saying, if people have read our writings over the years, that Hamilton is the most important intellect in terms of identifying an American system of economy that was unique to anything that came before and really anything that's come after. It was not, obviously, the British free trade system. We'll discuss a little bit of that. And it was clearly not, Marxism. And it's clearly not libertarianism. It was unique, and in the periods when we followed it, and even with the failures over the 200 and how many ever years, when the United States approximated these ideas of a strong central government, which is just anathema to everything people are taught today, and the left radio and the right radio and Fox News, big government, strong government, just the idea government, bad news, forget it, it's the enemy. And this is the fight that we have, you know, in organizing people, because the generation after Kennedy, I would say, you know, they've been, the whole idea is we're only interested in our state, we're only interested in our backyard, we're only interested in, you know, we're going to break up this California into 6 pieces, etc., because we're only interested in our narrow self-interests. And this was the British idea, which was advanced particularly by Adam Smith. We talk about Adam Smith because Adam Smith wrote, he's the chief one against which I think Hamilton polemicized, The Wealth of Nations, which people probably had the misfortune to have to study, which is the, you know, the basic textbook of most economic classes. Sorry. And this was written, look at the year, sorry, I'm writing 19, we don't have any eraser or something? It's written in 1776. And so here you had the Declaration of Independence, right? And then you've got this massive book written by Adam Smith at the same time as an apology for slavery and as an apology for the idea that nations would become wealthy, quote unquote. Remember, maybe some people don't know, Adam Smith was essentially hired by the British East India Company, which is the British Empire, to write this treatise to justify, thanks Gerald, the system of, to justify the slave system, to justify the idea that the way mankind operated was every man for himself, whether it's my state against your state, my backyard against your backyard, my race against your race, etc. And he promoted this idea of a comparative advantage in which somehow it's today, I guess, what approximates it in today's lexicon is the idea of a zero-sum game. There's a big field, and we're all competing, or a zoo, and there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And you had to have a hands-off position by the government. You had to have this system of quote-unquote competition, which is what you hear today, free enterprise sometimes. And people would, and human beings would just come together, you know, like a bunch of wrestlers or something. And some people would win and some people would lose. And so what Hamilton understood at the very beginning is that here you have 13 colonies, which, you know, are, as Maureen described, bankrupt, physically destroyed, disorganized. The people are kind of, how do you say, crazy or, you know, exhausted, and so on. And you have this empire that was running at the time about more than half of the planet in terms of land mass. I can't really say in terms of population, possibly so too. And so what Hamilton saw is that if there was no strong organizing principle, which we call a government, defending this nation, these 13 colonies that would become a nation, they become a union, that this big, ugly empire under the system of free trade, you jump in the zoo, I jump in the zoo, and we're going to fight, and obviously the big gorilla is going to win. That was the thing. So Hamilton, basically, was trying to lay down a philosophy that came out in what we had identified today as the American system, that not only would we protect through government power this new form of government, this experiment, which really was an experiment, but also that this new form of government would be governed by the principle of the inalienable rights of man, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, and really would be governed by the principle that every single human being living in that colony had a potential for creativity. We'll use that word today. Inventiveness is the word he used, and other things like that. We'll say creativity. And that what he would do is orchestrate a system of government where every single individual in those colonies, as wretched as they were at the end of the war, would be able to express, because of the way we organize the affairs of state, would be able to tap into and express this creativity, which Hamilton saw or understood at some level, maybe from his study of Greek classics or something, that every single individual had that capacity, even the slaves of the time. And so he wrote three, I'm skipping, but we can go to, more specific later. There are basically three important things that he, that are really critical for us today in understanding and fighting with this question. When LaRouche talks about, oh, that one's mine, that one's marked up. When LaRouche talks about, I might have given you two. Okay, thanks. When LaRouche talks about the idea that we have to have a credit system, or he says that we were founded on a credit system and not a monetary system. And when LaRouche insists on the idea of a union, and when LaRouche insists, particularly you see in our paradigm shows, on this idea of man is not an animal, you see this all expressed in three key writings of Hamilton. Let's see if I can get, I don't know if I'll get the name. One was the most famous one, which I think most people know, was the Report on Manufactures. There was the Report on Public Credit. I forgot to write the dates down exactly, but I'm going to find them in a minute. Or a credit system, as we call it today. And then on the National Bank. These are reports to Congress. So we're in a situation where at the end of the war, the United States is bankrupt. And if you look at that paper that I gave you, I should have done it so we could put it on the board. This is the first one we're going to. You see that there's a whole bunch of debt, which says the state debt, domestic debt, and the amounts, which was largely debt that was owed from people who loaned money to help to fight the war, people who made loans to the Revolutionary Army or to General Washington to be able to finance the war. And also you had vouchers or debts, which were, they owed salaries to the veterans of the war. They hadn't been, many of them still hadn't been paid. And they were holding these certificates, I don't know if that's the right word, and they were losing value, and the country was bankrupt. So Hamilton had to figure out, he made a commitment that we were not going to cancel the debt. He was not going to repudiate the debt. And that was a big deal, because many of the people, including Jefferson, who were sort of, who were free trade types, to put it simply, believed that we should just repudiate the debt and start over. And then, of course, some of this debt I forgot to mention. Well, it says there's state debt, meaning that the states owed money to the federal government because the states made loans to help fight in the war. So Hamilton did something brilliant, which most people here have probably heard LaRouche say several times. And I tried to say it several times, and half the time it slips out of my head, and I tried to get it back again. But this little thing helps here. Because what Hamilton, in first of all saying that we're not going to repudiate this debt, what he says is where the government is going to take this debt in, and the government is going to fund this debt by issuing new credit. He's going to turn debt into credit under the sovereign power of the government of the United States. He's not arguing with anybody about free trade. He's not arguing about anybody about what is this, do you have the power to do this or not? He's got the idea in his head that this is a legitimate, honorable debt. How do we organize things in such a way, financially, economically, that we honor this debt, but we don't just print up a bunch of paper and give it to people for them to feel good? Because as we'll probably go into later if we have the time, he goes into the whole difference between credit versus paper money and specie, gold and silver and things like that, and property, something that LaRouche always talks about, the whole idea of economic value, what economic value is. So what he does is he, quote unquote, funds the debt, assumes the debt, issues new certificates to the states and to the soldiers, but he issues that on the guarantee that this new credit that he's giving to them is going to be invested through the National Bank into big projects. And in those days, you see it says here, loans on the credit of the U.S. debt to commerce, to agriculture, to industry, and also to government. And it's brilliant because what Hamilton is thinking is, he's thinking of the future. He's thinking, if I use the power of the government to take this quote-unquote debt, generate new credit off of the debt, and the credit is that this is going to be invested in internal improvements, in manufacturing, in the Erie Canal, in whatever, projects. This debt will not only be repaid, but the citizen who is making this quote-unquote sacrifice is now participating in the improvement of the nation. And the identity of the citizen is no longer, I live in Virginia, and I've got this debt, and it's losing paper, and I give it to the crazy federal government, and they're not really my friend. And so the citizen is now invested in the future of the nation and in the progress of the nation. And so the progress of the nation becomes not just important, but it becomes the citizen is induced to participate in the progress of the nation, in thinking about the future, and therefore the citizen acting today with let's say he's got a whole bunch of debt, can view this not as a burden, not as something negative. This is something that through our newly constituted government, I can turn into the improvement of my nation. That makes me a citizen of the nation under a national economic system, under a national bank, out of the states' rights confederacy thing that had existed up to that time. And I was, we can read a bit of it here. You see the second paragraph. It says, let me think. No, we'll start from the first paragraph. It says, the terms of funding the debt held by the creditors of the United States, which are the states, the veterans, other people, were set by the sovereign nation. The United States was not submitting to a foreign power to borrow money from a foreign power, for example. Similarly, when the government borrowed from the National Bank, it was not going into debt according to the terms of a private bank, but a bank whose charter was created by the government and whose capital was fused with the success of the government's finances. Then it says, debt was redefined. Hamilton redefined. I don't know if anybody has done any other, maybe people in this room know better than I do. But redefining debt in this way, I don't know, had it ever been done before? I don't think so. Yeah. Says debt was redefined, therefore, as not merely a monetary debt that was to be simply paid back in money saved, but reflected in the whole process of unifying the resources of the national economy with a currency that reflected the promise of a sovereign government. As the power of the productive economy grew industry, so reciprocally did the national bank's value of capital and the general value of the public debt. Therefore, when the government borrows from the national bank, the government borrows from a source which is a representation of the real industrial and agricultural growth, not from a piggy bank. You see? This whole idea here, representation of the real industrial and agricultural growth. This idea that you're investing in growing the economy, you're growing into the future, the idea of progress. And then it says further, unlike the acts of the Bank of England 1694, the Federal Reserve, Hamilton's National Bank could not buy government debt. The government debt made up a large portion of its founding capital stock, and those who were holders of public debt could deposit it in the bank, like the veterans and the other people, further increasing the bank's capital stock. But the bank itself could not purchase debt or trade in debt. Think about the banks today and the Federal Reserve and derivatives. Only in bills, the bank itself could not purchase or trade in debt, only in bills of exchange and coin. The bank is not at liberty to purchase any public debt whatsoever, and so on. The U.S. government therefore had complete control of the value of its debt. So that really covers both the business, the public credit, and the national bank. But in that vein came the question, which goes down then into the matter of manufactures, which was the kind of philosophical conflict, I guess, between Jefferson, who, and he was one of the signers and so on, who insisted on an agrarian economy, including the plantation economy, and Hamilton, who insisted on manufactures, who insisted that we were going to, I'm going to read some stuff from him in a minute, insisted that we were going to not remain simply a state that was in agricultural production or whatever, whether it was cotton or whatever. So Hamilton insisted, first of all, not only that this government credit would be specifically directed towards mining, iron ore was a big deal for him, and finishing the iron ore into iron in the United States as opposed to the way it was before, where the British mined the iron ore, took it to Britain, finished it in Britain, and then sold it back to us at maybe 10 times the price. Hamilton insisted that we would, instead of just mining and growing cotton or whatever we were growing, that we would develop machinery, technology, science, so that we, the United States, outside of what the British were doing, would be able to take our resources, let's say in this case iron ore, and finish it into iron, and later on insisted that these two, that an agrarian, a farming system, or agriculture I should say, and manufacturers were not necessarily hostile to each other, and that we would have an agro-industrial system. I don't know if he's the first person that coined that term, but he, as opposed to Jefferson, who was saying that manufacturers and the way that Hamilton was viewing it was destroying it was kind of like an environmentalist, I suppose, was destroying the natural way that the colonies developed, was basically Jefferson's argument. Hamilton insisted, first of all, on becoming a scientific manufacturing nation, but then that the improvements in science and technology and machinery would help to improve and transform the agrarian society into no longer becoming agrarian, but really agro-industrial. And again, that the government would, through government credit, as opposed to the states connected to the plantations, that the government, through government credit, would prioritize scientific ventures, inventions, internal improvements in terms of infrastructure to be able to transport the minerals or whatever it was. And once we got that moving, this would be used to change the so-called agrarian way of life that the United States was before. And this is a principal, fundamental, philosophical difference between these two guys. So, okay, let's see. I'm trying not to jump too much. Right now, when LaRouche is saying that essentially, he says we got to shut down Wall Street, but really, what LaRouche is saying is that the British philosophical outlook that clearly influenced to some extent Jefferson and of course some of the other founding fathers, that this outlook took over the United States in the form of the big guerrilla setting up shop on what we know today as Wall Street. And that they have captured the United States financial system from what it used to be. And they have turned the United States financial economic system into this, I'm going to find it in a minute and read it, into this, carousel of paper speculation and so on and so forth, which has no connection to the physical production. But more importantly, he also discusses how because certain of these fellows had property, i.e. land or slaves, or they had gold or diamonds, gold or silver, that this idea that Jefferson promoted was not really true because they had a power over the rest of the country in terms of, property wealth, physical wealth, that the rest of the country did not have. But Hamilton saw that if we went with this system, going back to the idea of creativity and inventions and so on and so forth, that this system would be the system that would, he thought, become the system in the whole world. And so now LaRouche is basically saying that this British system that infected the United States and is now dominating the United States through Wall Street, that we have to, in our Manhattan Project, people heard about the Manhattan Project, or sometimes called the Hamilton Project, which we're pushing with our efforts in New York City, that the idea is we're going to wrest control again. We're going to take back control of our system, of our economic financial system, and put it back under this Hamiltonian idea. And this is what LaRouche talks about, people seen especially in the last few weeks, where LaRouche talks about an orderly bankruptcy reorganization of the financial system, in somewhat of an echo of what you see represented in this thing here of what Hamilton did at the end of the war, when the country was bankrupt and owed a whole lot of money to states and veterans and other people. and didn't know how we would solve the problem except that Hamilton came up with this brilliant idea. So let me just read you a couple of things to give you an idea of. And you know, Maureen didn't go through it, but fundamentally, in the end, with Hamilton being assassinated, really in this duel, was all was part of this whole process of the fight between him and Madison, him and Jefferson, Washington, and so on. Washington and Hamilton's side most of the time, over what kind of a system we were going to have, and of course, Aaron Burr, represented the financial interests. Hang on a second. Let's see if I can find this quote here. Okay, this is, he's writing to Robert Morris, who I think was one of the biggest funders of the revolution, or went out and raised a lot of money for the revolution. This is Hamilton writing to Morris on April 30th, 1781. He says, "It is by introducing order into our finances, by restoring public credit, not by gaining battles, that we are finally to gain our object." The object of this union, sovereign union. While Congress continues altogether dependent on the occasional grants of the several states for the means of defraying the expenses of the federal government, it can neither have dignity, vigor, nor credit. There are some among us ignorant enough to imagine that the war may be carried on without credit, defraying the expenses of the year with what may be raised within the year. And I give you the date on that. He says then, "A plan must be devised which, by incorporating their means together and uniting them with those of the public, will, on the foundation of that incorporation and union, erect a mass of credit that will supply the defect of moneyed capital and answer all the purposes of cash. A plan which will offer adventurers immediate advantages analogous to those they receive by employing their money in trade, and eventually greater advantages. A plan which will give them the greatest security the nature of the case will admit for what they lend, and which will not only advance their own interest and secure the independence of their country, but in its progress have the most beneficial influence upon its future commerce, and be a source of national strength and wealth. I mean the institution of a national bank." And there's a lot more. A lot of this, by the way, people, this pamphlet, this Nawapa report has a whole section in here on Hamilton, and so on. Now, the other thing that, going past my time, the other thing that Hamilton was famous for, which became a nasty word over the last decades, is protectionism. In which Hamilton, in order to protect the fledgling industries that were developing in the United States, set up very high or stiff tariffs and to keep out, let's say, the dumping of cheap goods, where the British could bring goods from India or some other part of the world where they could get it cheap, whatever it is, raw materials, and dump it in the United States. So Hamilton set up a system of very strong tariffs, and then set up a program, which is going to sound very interesting, if I can find my pages, to the ear, to what we hear nowadays. Hang on just a second, I hope I have it. Yeah. So in the report on manufacturers, it's 1794, December 15th, he delivered a report on manufacturers to the Congress. And he said to secure American independence, the United States needed to encourage manufacturing as a permanent feature of its system. So he set up tariffs, both as a source of revenue for the federal government, but also as a way of keeping out the dumping cheap goods. He gave subsidies, government subsidies, imagine saying that nowadays, to private industries, gave them subsidies to encourage them to produce and become more efficient, and so on. He had a big program promoting immigration, because he realized that we didn't have enough, if you're going to have a manufacturing economy, you were going to need diversified employment and division of labor, and we didn't have enough people in the colonies. So he set up a system to promote immigration into the United States. And then also set up a specific fund to, as he said, expand scientific and technological applications to manufacturing and agriculture. And let's see, I'm trying to go a little fast here. But anyway, in a nutshell, what we've done over the last 230 odd years is not that we've gone back to a system where specie, and not even specie anymore, but paper rules the world. Financial paper rules the world. What LaRouche is saying now is that whole system, epitomized by Wall Street, is coming down and going to crash. The British, just as they were hysterical at the establishment of the colonies and what Hamilton was attempting to do with the colonies, with a national bank and so on, wanted to go for war, exactly today intend, with the collapse of their financial system, to go for war and even risk thermonuclear war, because they cannot live in a system where what I described briefly at the beginning, where the idea that every single human individual, including the slaves, had a certain quality, a divine quality, which was expressed in the Constitution in the idea of the inalienable rights of every man, woman. The British cannot live in a world where that will be allowed to flourish and dominate. That's the crux of the matter. Mm-hmm. And that's the crux of the matter between what Hamilton represents, what the American system represents, and what, unfortunately, we have adopted as, I don't know what you call it, what do they call it, free enterprise or free trade system or something?
Free market.
Free market, What we've adopted as today what much of the world identifies as the American system, which is this crazy free market system, which is completely anathema to everything that Hamilton as an individual fought for. It's the other interesting thing that you see with Hamilton, and maybe it goes back to this question of him studying the classics and stuff, and you see the same thing with LaRouche, is you see just one individual sovereign mind battling over certain philosophical ideas and advancing it and developing it and promoting it and polemicizing for it and continuously battling and advancing those ideas. One particular maybe Maureen knows better, but I don't get any sense from what I've read that he, was part of a group or a social process or had a mentor
He seemed to be the
that was
initiator.
that was guiding him in these kinds of things. It just seems like it was one individual sovereign mind, just like you see with LaRouche, who was looking at the situation, had an idea of what the human being really could represent in terms of this idea of creativity, the divine spark, and that if he could devise a system to make this spark turn into a big, good fire, that this would fulfill as much as possible for that time the potential of mankind for the future. Just kind of like China today, I suppose, going to Mars and helium-3 and all that stuff. And you see the same thing with LaRouche in terms of this battle over 40 years. Looking at the problems, looking at the crises, and then looking at the fundamental questions that needed to be attacked and solved and advanced on, the fundamental issues, to just transform society for 100 years or what, which of course is what LaRouche has done now with this BRICS thing. It's like this little fire that's been going in LaRouche's mind for 40 years or whatever. It's now caught a fire in a big old conflagration with what the BRICS are doing. And so, we can't really do justice to Hamilton in an hour or an hour and a half even. You can't do justice to this person, to this individual. I just tried to give you a flavor, and what I would recommend that people do is read these. The report on manufacturers is very long, but in some respects, it's it's easier to apprehend. It's easier to comprehend, because we've got an idea of inventions and technological breakthroughs taking you to new platforms and stuff like that. The other two might be a little more difficult, but you got to fight with it, because it's not only going to make you open your mind up to a whole new cosmic space of where we could go, but it's also going to really equip you to really penetrate the brainwashing of our citizenry, who've adopted all kinds of things as patriotic and American, and these things are completely the opposite of what this fellow in particular represented and meant and instituted as probably the most important intellectual author of this American system. Let me see if there's anything else I want to go through. And I can't remember if Maureen said or not. Yeah, I think she did. That he was one of the, in 1779, proposed the formation of 2 to 3 battalions of Negroes for the Revolutionary War. He says this will open the door to emancipation. And then he was a founding member of the Society for the Promotion of Manumission of Slaves with John Jay, and so on. But, he did a whole lot of things. The Bank of New York, the Bank of the United States, Treasury Secretary, military guy, aide-de-camp to Washington, all these things. But in his mind, you've got this fire of discovery going on to craft this unique form of government and unique economic system to guide this form of government. So that's what I'll say. Again, we can't do justice to it in a short period of time, but hopefully I'm giving you a flavor of it, because we got to take, when we go out to the field and people tell us these things about free trade or whatever, and, you want to get a sort of tit for tat back and forth with some fact about why what they're saying is wrong. If we could get them up on the philosophical level and get the argument there, get them thinking up at that level, then we'll actually change them. And that's the kind of change we're going to have to make if we're going to get this United States to join the BRICS. So we don't have a lot of time. So anyhow, So that's in a quick sketch. What I wanted to give just a, as I say, a idea of what this unique individual represented. And most people don't know anything about him. When you talk in the field, they'll know about Jefferson. The post office had something like a year or two ago. Was it about John Adams, I think? You remember when they had all the big displays in the post office? Yeah, she says. Very Chris. And of course, people know about Washington as a general and so on, but really, people don't really know much about Hamilton, and they don't really understand what an intellectual force he was.
They don't teach it in school.
They don't teach it in school, and that and that without his intellect and his thirst for discovery, we never would have been able to secure the United States. And if we don't get him back, so to speak, we're not going to be able to secure the United States, because this Wall Street cancer, when it gets all exhausted, is going to take us all down with it unless we revive this Hamilton system. I think that's why LaRouche has been so over and over again insistent about this Hamilton project and going back into New York and going into Manhattan and stuff. It's almost like if we're going into Manhattan, and standing there representing Alexander Hamilton in front of the devil, in front of the Wall Street bankers, and some of them might decide that they don't want to stick with the devil. Okay, questions? Maureen, you want to come up too? You've got to answer some of these questions. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, but this is an appropriate place to read this, because there was one American who did appreciate Alexander Hamilton.
Besides FDR.
Huh?
Besides FDR.
Besides FDR, but anyway, it was, this was a proclamation by the President of the United States of America. It's basically commemorating the 200th anniversary of Hamilton's birth. So it was 1957, commemorating the 1757 birth, and it was Dwight Eisenhower. He made a proclamation to the whole United States, and he said, 169 years ago in September, the Constitution was signed by the Founding Fathers, and a crucial 9-month campaign for its adoption was begun. And he said, as we celebrate that, it is fitting that we take notice of Alexander Hamilton, who at the age of 30 was recognized as one of the principal architects and leaders of the movement for a more perfect union of the United States. And then he goes on to praise him. He said, Alexander Hamilton served his country well throughout his life. During the Revolutionary War as aide-de-camp and military secretary to General Washington, as commander of the American columns in the final assault on Yorktown, and later as major general and senior officer of the Army. And he served in all these conventions, Continental Congress, the Assembly of the State of New York, Annapolis, Philadelphia. And he said, now, the opportunity has come for our generation to demonstrate our gratitude and our obligation to Alexander Hamilton by a fitting celebration of his 200th anniversary birth. A happy opportunity for all of us to think afresh of his sincere efforts and inspiring leadership in the work of the men who laid the foundations, raised the structure, and built the sustaining traditions of the government of the United States. And he's basically saying that we're going to celebrate this. I don't know if it was for a whole year or for, a whole day, but a whole year. But anyways, it was Dwight Eisenhower signing this, in honor of Alexander Hamilton.
I like that.
Yeah, he was the general too.
Go ahead. You have a question?
Well, what you've inspired me to do is to write an article about Alexander Hamilton, because about 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote an article singing the praises of Andrew Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so thankful that I never got it published. But I honestly believed, and I've had people tell me, Eric, you gotta get this published. It's a great article about Andrew Jackson. Before I really understood what the true Americanist system really was, and I thought I had it all down. And with your presentation, it's very clear to see the reason that the British-dominated system of today would discredit him, and why so many kids today think that Alexander Hamilton was a tyrant and a traitor.
That's the other thing I forgot to say in the beginning is Hamilton is slandered as a monarchist, as a guy who wanted the United States to be an empire, as essentially a tyrant.
Because he said strong central
Because
government.
he was for strong central government, he was a tyrant. That's a libertarian view. We run into them in the field, and as an elitist, that he was an elitist. The elitist thing came from the fact that it's not that he scorned the agrarian system. He just thought that the United States had to evolve, and that part of the evolution of the United States would be converting the agrarian system through industry and machines and science and technology into an agro-industrial system, like what we know as scientific farming, for example, as opposed to a slave state. But yeah, the people slander him as an elitist, as a monarchist, and he was for the Federal Reserve. He was for a central bank.
Nothing like
exactly the opposite. Exactly.
And I love Alexander Hamilton. One of the reasons is that he took the Bible to his grave with him. He said, "I live by this word and I die by it." And he held that until his very last day, while Jefferson held the message of the Bible in disdain. He was disdainful of it. And if I do an article on Alexander Hamilton and you read the one I did on Andrew Jackson, and you read the one on Andrew Jackson, you're going to say, "Did Eric write that?" Yes, I did. I'd be more than happy to show you both. But I want to say about Adam Smith, when he said "every man for himself," that was
freedom. Yeah.
An Illuminati concept. It was Weishaupt who said "every man is a law unto himself," and then as far as the breaking up of nations, breaking up of things, survival of the fittest. That's survival of the fittest. That's Darwinian.
Yeah.
And then a couple other real quickies here. I want to say that if it weren't for the industrial complex, we would have lost the war between the states. We would have lost that war. It would have been a Confederate victory had we not had the industrial complex that propelled us to victory. And then the last thing I want to say here is that an interesting comparison sometime, when we can do it, maybe a session on it, would be a comparison of the National Bank effort in 1812 that the British tried to force on the country, for which we went to war again on, versus what Hamilton wanted and John Quincy Adams were for in the mid-1830s, and Jackson killed that, which led us to the war between the states. And then you might even want to do a comparison with the 1863 National Leasing Act, which Lincoln was more or less forced into. That's a subject in itself too, what that was all about, and compare all that. And it's the Hamiltonian one, the one that they squelched, which is what we really needed. And then we could have had this progress without a war.
Yeah. Well, see, going back to the business, again, the business of the Civil War, and the business of the South breaking from the United States, and the British supporting them, was the same. It's the same question. An agrarian slave society, in which you had a landed aristocracy.
Landed aristocracy.
Right. Jefferson was a landed aristocrat, by the way, and then you had slaves. And Hamilton, on the other hand, felt again, probably informed by the classics, informed by Christianity, that that there was an incredible wealth in every human being that could just completely transform these colonies, you know, and make them the beacon on the hill or whatever. And he saw that through science, scientific inventions, as they called it, scientific endeavor, and all that stuff. And it was completely anathema to what the British idea of maintaining a world where a small aristocracy ran the rest of the world's population in colonies and empires and stuff like that. It's the same fight.
Yeah. Remember, I mean, the thing I read where he had the military orders to this General Larouche or something to begin recruiting black soldiers because we were going to free. So every single person who joined the army was going to be freed. You know, during the American Revolution, there wasn't going to be a plantation system. I mean, there wasn't. He hated the plantation system. He hated the Southern faction, and he was already organizing for that. I mean, you know, everyone knows the grief that Lincoln was going through, but it was already being organized. So every single liar about the founding of our country, you know, who says to you, this country, you know, Hamilton is a monarch, blah, 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 they're just, I mean, they're such liars. You can't even refute it as, you know, well, let me give you the fact. You just have to say you don't understand a thing, period, case closed. You are, as Hamilton described the army, they're a bunch of barbarians. You know, the white soldiers were acting like barbarians. And then he's saying, we need, you know, I'm going to organize every prejudice you have about your life, about your state's rights. I'm going to organize every prejudice so you can pass this Constitution and we can go on. I mean, what Lena laid out was perfect on the question of the agrarian versus the manufacturing. But what, Chuck?
The one thing that, real quick, is on this monarchy thing, is, you know, he wrote another paper called, I think, on Defense of the National Bank.
Yeah.
And Washington sided with Franklin with Hamilton on this idea of the national bank. That it was constitutional. So if you go on this monarchist thing, it doesn't quite hold.
Yeah.
Because here's the guy who advocated after 2 terms because he didn't want to have traditional monarchy with, you know, founder of the United States, and it's that, you know, it's pretty off the wall.
You said I'm not your king.
Yeah.
Yeah. But see, going back to this again, I don't know if I got the idea. This separation, you know, I'm saying it in terms of the British Empire, a slave system, an agrarian system, and stuff like that. It wasn't that they were just simply opposed, they were opposed. But Hamilton saw manufacturers and science and stuff to transform the society. He saw this as a civilizing force on a backward agrarian system. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just that there was two different systems opposed. He was saying, if we could tap into this quality that makes man in the image of God, let's say, we could get a spark going here and we can transform and civilize these colonies and become one sovereign nation committed to and being an exemplar of the idea of progress. Because of this here, not because of species, not because of land, not because of property, which is land and slaves, not because of gold and diamonds, but because of this here. And this is the key thing in LaRouche's economics, this whole fight about economic value. What is economic value? You know, which is the fight we've got right now with all this paper that's floating around and all these people who say they're worth so many billions of dollars.